Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into a movie that bombed so hard in theaters that studios probably wanted to forget it existed, and yet it clawed its way into cult classic status through sheer stubbornness and word of mouth. We're talking about Grandma's Boy, the 2006 stoner comedy about a video game tester who gets evicted and ends up crashing at his grandmother's house with her two equally wild roommates. Directed by Nicholas Goosen and produced under Adam Sandler's Happy Madison banner. It's a movie that critics largely tore apart when it opened, only for it to quietly become one of the most quoted comedies of its generation once it left theaters behind. It didn't make much noise at the box office, but on DVD, it became an underground phenomenon. The kind of movie people discovered on a friend's couch at 2 in the morning and then couldn't stop repeating lines from for the next decade. So grab a snack, settle in, and let's get into 20 facts about this movie that even longtime fans might not know. For most of the late 90s and early 2000s, Alan Covert was the guy standing just off to the side of Adam Sandler in almost every Happy Madison production. He was Otto, the deranged groundskeeper in Happy Gilmore. He popped up in The Waterboy. He was scattered across The Wedding Singer and Big Daddy. Always a face you recognized, but rarely a name you knew. Grandma's Boy flipped that script entirely. Covert didn't just star in it. He co-wrote it and helped produce it, which meant this was the one time in his career he got to build a movie around himself instead of orbiting someone else's spotlight. Reportedly, the seed of the story came from a real chapter of his life, when he temporarily moved back in with family to help out after his father went through a serious medical procedure. That personal detail got exaggerated, stretched, and covered in bong smoke for the final film, but the emotional bones, a grown man humbled enough to move back in with an older relative, stayed intact. Sandler, for his part, didn't appear on screen at all. Instead, he backed the project financially and creatively through Happy Madison Productions, essentially handing his longtime collaborator the keys for once. It's worth pointing out how rare that kind of handoff is in Hollywood comedy circles. Usually the biggest name in the room ends up front and center no matter whose idea it originally was. That Sandler stepped back and let Covert carry the film speaks to how much trust had built up between the two of them after nearly 2 decades of working together, going all the way back to their days as classmates before either of them had a career in comedy at all. Blink and you might miss him, but Jonah Hill is right there in the video game office as Barry, one of Alex's co-workers. At the time this movie came out in January 2006, Hill was still very much a working actor rather than a star. He'd had a small early part in I Heart Huckabees and a minor role in The 40-Year-Old Virgin, but the film that truly launched him into the mainstream, Superbad, was still more than a year away from release. Watching Grandma's Boy now feels a bit like finding an old photograph of someone famous before they were famous. The awkward, motor-mouthed energy that would define a lot of his early comedic work is already fully formed here, just on a much smaller stage. It's one of those roles that fans only really appreciate in hindsight, once they know what Hill would go on to become. Rewatching the film today, there's an odd novelty to seeing him play a fairly minor supporting character with none of the star treatment he'd get just a couple years later. It's a reminder that plenty of now famous comedic actors spent time bouncing between small studio comedies before landing the one role that changed everything, and Grandma's Boy just happened to be one of the stops along Hill's particular path. Casting a relative unknown in a supporting comedic role was a low-risk move for the production at the time, but it's paid off enormously in hindsight, since his presence now gives the film an extra layer of appeal for viewers who are specifically hunting for early performances by actors who later became major stars. One of the more surprising rabbit holes connected to this movie involves the fictional game that Alex and his coworkers are building at their studio. Behind the scenes, there was an actual video game in development that shared a very similar identity, planned for release on the Xbox 360 through publisher Majesco Entertainment. Before the film even hit theaters, Majesco ran into serious financial trouble, and the real game got quietly shelved. What's wild is that some of the game footage and assets that had already been created for that scrap project ended up being folded into the movie itself. So in a strange twist, a video game that never officially came out technically survives today only as a prop inside a completely different piece of media, a ghost of a canceled Xbox game, hiding in plain sight inside a stoner comedy. For anyone who was following gaming news around 2005 and 2006, there's a genuinely eerie feeling to watching those cutscenes and menu screens pop up on screen, knowing that footage was originally meant for an actual console release that consumers never got the chance to play. Casting-wise, this might be one of the biggest left turns in the whole film. Doris Roberts spent years as Marie Barone on Everybody Loves Raymond, a role so iconic it earned her 4 Emmy wins and cemented her as one of the most recognizable moms in sitcom history. Then, in 2006, she showed up as Grandma Lily, sweet, a little overbearing, and eventually accidentally stoned out of her mind after unknowingly eating a marijuana-laced treat. It's genuinely jarring to see an actress so associated with wholesome, naggy sitcom energy leaning into a role that required her to play blissfully baked in front of the camera. That contrast is exactly why the performance works as well as it does. Her comedic timing from decades of sitcom were translated perfectly into a scene that could have easily felt cheap in less capable hands. Roberts had already built a career on playing loud, opinionated, deeply loving matriarch figures, and Grandma Lily is really just that same archetype dropped into a much raunchier world. It takes real skill to make an accidental marijuana brownie scene land as genuinely funny rather than mean-spirited, and a lot of that comes down to how committed and unguarded her performance is. During the filming of the eviction sequence, things veered off script in a way that ended up sticking. One of the actors began riffing between takes, throwing out lines that weren't in the original screenplay. When Adam Sandler happened to be visiting the set that day, he reportedly encouraged one particular improvised insult to be shouted louder and leaned in harder, and the resulting delivery got such a big laugh from the crew that it made the final cut. From that point on, according to accounts from people who worked on the film, whenever Sandler showed up on set for the rest of the shoot, crew members would jokingly shout the same line back at him as a running bit. It's a small detail, but it says a lot about how loose and collaborative the atmosphere on a Happy Madison set tends to be. Scripted jokes get written, but the best ones often happen by accident. Plenty of the studio's other comedies from this same era carry that same reputation for looseness, where directors would let cameras roll a little longer than necessary just to see what actors came up with when they stopped worrying about hitting their marks. That kind of environment doesn't work for every production, but for a movie built entirely around chaotic, low-stakes humor, it was exactly the right approach. This is probably the most notorious behind-the-scenes story tied to the movie. Peter Dante, who plays the weed dealer character, was initially handed fake herbal cigarettes for the scenes where his character takes bong hits. He wasn't satisfied with how fake it looked on camera, so during retakes he swapped in the real thing. The result is that the hazy, glassy-eyed reactions audiences see on screen during that sequence weren't acting at all. According to castmate and co-writer Nick Swardson, the hits were strong enough that Dante started to feel genuinely impaired partway through filming, to the point where he reportedly lost feeling in his legs and mentioned needing medical attention. It's the kind of story that sounds exaggerated for effect, but it's been repeated by multiple people involved in the production, which lends it a surprising amount of credibility for something this absurd. It also explains why the scene has such a lived-in, almost documentary quality compared to a lot of drug use scenes in other comedies, where actors are visibly performing being high rather than actually experiencing it. Whatever the exact truth behind the story, the finished footage is undeniably convincing, which is more than can be said for most simulated intoxication scenes in studio comedies from that decade. Shirley Jones plays Grace, one of the 2 roommates living with Grandma Lily, and her casting is another one of those quiet jaw-droppers. Most audiences know her as the warm, singing matriarch from the Partridge Family, a role that defined family-friendly television for a generation. In Grandma's Boy, she's cast wildly against that image, flirtatious, blunt, and completely unbothered by the film's raunchier humor. What makes it even more surprising is that Jones isn't just a beloved TV mom. She's a legitimate Academy Award winner, having taken home Best Supporting Actress in 1960 for her performance in Elmer Gantry, where she played a vengeful sex worker in a serious dramatic role. Seeing her decades later, gleefully embracing an outrageous comedic part in a movie full of drug jokes, is a genuinely unexpected full-circle moment for anyone who knows her full body of work. It's a reminder that a lot of actors who become permanently associated with one squeaky clean role actually spent their careers taking far riskier, more dramatic parts long before audiences pigeonholed them. And Grandma's Boy gave Jones a rare chance to remind people of that range in a comedic setting. Rounding out Grandma's trio of roommates is B, played by Shirley Knight, whose resume is arguably even more decorated than Jones's. Knight picked up 2 Best Supporting Actress nominations over her career, for The Dark at the Top of the Stairs and Sweet Bird of Youth, and beyond her film work, she also won a Tony Award and multiple Emmys across a long stage and television career. Put all 3 of the grandmother generation actresses together, Roberts, Jones, and Knight, and you've got a combined haul of an Oscar win, 2 additional Oscar nominations, a Tony, and a shelf full of Emmys, all stacked into one trio of characters who spend most of their screen time cracking dirty jokes and accidentally getting high. It's a genuinely absurd amount of prestige talent tucked into a low-budget stoner comedy that most critics wrote off at the time. Whenever people talk about underrated casting choices in comedy films, this trio rarely comes up, but it probably should. Few raunchy studio comedies from that era could claim 3 actresses with credentials this heavy playing characters this unapologetically silly. On paper, the theatrical run looks like a disaster. Essentially became a grassroots hit, passed from one dorm room or friend group to the next long after any studio executive had stopped paying attention to it. Comparing the theatrical numbers to the eventual home video totals also makes for a genuinely striking case study in how misleading opening weekend performance can be when trying to predict a film's long-term cultural footprint, since by nearly every measure this movie ended up vastly out-earning and outlasting plenty of comedies that opened much bigger that same year. If you don't already know to look for him, you'll probably miss Rob Schneider entirely. He plays Yuri, the thickly accented Eastern European landlord who kicks off the entire plot by evicting Alex and his roommate in the opening scenes. The performance is buried under enough of an accent and physical transformation that casual viewers often have no idea it's him. And to make the cameo even sneakier, he isn't credited by name for the role. It's a classic Happy Madison move. Sneak a familiar face into a small but pivotal part and let eagle-eyed fans discover it themselves rather than announcing it up front. David Spade pulls a similar trick later in the film, showing up briefly as a waiter at a vegan restaurant in a role so minor and so disguised that it functions almost like a scavenger hunt reward for people paying close attention. Both cameos reinforce just how tight-knit the Happy Madison circle really was during this stretch of the 2000s, with familiar faces from Sandler's other films sliding in and out of small roles almost as favors, trusting that the finished product would be worth the brief, uncredited detour. The beat-up, barely functioning car Alex drives throughout the movie looks like a deliberate character detail, reinforcing the idea of a guy whose life is a mess. In reality, it was reportedly more about money than storytelling. The production allegedly ran short on funds by the time they needed to secure a vehicle for the character. So instead of picking something that fit a specific creative vision, they grabbed whatever cheap, rundown option was available. It ended up working in the film's favor anyway, blending seamlessly into the scrappy, low-budget aesthetic that defines the whole movie. Sometimes the most memorable details in a comedy aren't the product of careful planning. They're just what happens when a small crew has to make do with what they can afford. It's a small case study in how limited resources can accidentally improve a film rather than hurt it, since a pristine, well-chosen car might have actually undercut the scrappy, broke guy energy the character was supposed to radiate. Grandma's Boy was co-written by Alan Covert, Nick Swardson, and Barry Wernick, and Swardson also appears on screen as Jeff, the man-child roommate who still sleeps in a bed shaped like a race car. That level of creative overlap between writing and acting is fairly common in Happy Madison productions. But what's notable is how quickly this same writing duo turned around another project. Just a few months after Grandma's Boy hit theaters, Covert and Swardson were back with The Benchwarmers, another comedy that would go on to build its own dedicated following. Both films share that scrappy, joke-dense DNA, and both eventually found audiences who quote them years after release, even though neither one was a theatrical juggernaut at the time. Having two projects release so close together also meant Covert and Swartzen were essentially working nonstop through this stretch of their careers, cranking out material back-to-back rather than taking time off between projects, which probably explains why both scripts share such a similar comedic rhythm. Eagle-eyed viewers might notice posters scattered around the video game studio referencing something called Gay Robot, which looks like a throwaway visual gag, but actually connects to a much bigger story. The character originated years earlier as a sketch on one of Adam Sandler's comedy albums, with Nick Swartzen voicing the part. That bit apparently gained enough traction behind the scenes that there were real efforts to develop it into its own television series, reportedly including both animated and live-action versions being pitched around. None of it ever made it to air, but the character's ghost lives on in the background art of Grandma's Boy, a small inside joke rewarding anyone who happens to know the character's strange, mostly forgotten backstory. It's a nice example of how tightly interconnected this whole era of Sandler-adjacent comedy really was. Bits from comedy albums bleeding into film posters, characters from one project cameoing visually in another, all building a shared universe of running gags that only die-hard fans would ever piece together. Unlike a lot of comedies that use gamer culture as a vague punchline, Grandma's Boy leans into specifics that only people who actually played games in that era would catch. There's a large promotional statue of Naked Snake from Metal Gear Solid 3 sitting prominently in a character's office, a genuine collector's item rather than a generic prop. The office doors in that same space are styled to resemble